Medicine has always walked a thin line between hope and horror. For every groundbreaking discovery that saved millions, there have been hidden chapters soaked in cruelty, ambition, and moral blindness. The white coat, a symbol of healing and trust, has sometimes concealed something darker, an unchecked hunger to push the boundaries of human knowledge no matter the cost. But among all the dark corners of medical history, one story rises like a nightmare that refuses to fade. It is not the tale of battlefield amputations, not of plague doctors or crude surgeries in candlelit rooms. This is the story of a doctor who turned children into unwilling test subjects, who saw innocence not as something to protect but as raw material for his experiments. He was celebrated as a genius, respected in his time, even protected by powerful institutions. Yet behind closed doors, in the sterile silence of laboratories and hospital wards, he inflicted horrors on the most defenseless of all children who had no voice, no family to protect them, no escape from the steel grip of science gone mad. Imagine being a parent in a time when medicine was still finding its footing. The promise of vaccines, cures, and scientific miracles offered a beacon of hope. Families trusted doctors almost like priests, guardians of life and death. This trust was a shield, and it was easily exploited. The doctor at the center of this story knew exactly how to wear the mask of benevolence. To the public, he was brilliant, compassionate, a savior of the sick. To his colleagues, he was ambitious, tireless, perhaps even obsessive, but undeniably talented. No one dared to question him, and those who did were silenced with reputation, wealth, or fear. But behind the curtain, children became the currency of his obsession. Orphans were easiest. No parents to ask questions, no one to mourn when their tiny bodies failed under the weight of experiments. Disabled children, too, were seen as expendable, less than human in the cruel logic of the time. They were strapped to tables, injected, deprived of food, subjected to procedures that would make even hardened soldiers tremble. And all of it was recorded, charted, and justified in the language of progress. The experiments were not random acts of cruelty. They were deliberate, meticulous, carried out with the cold precision of someone who believed that human suffering was just another variable in an equation. He wanted results. He wanted recognition. He wanted to carve his name into the marble walls of medical history, no matter how much blood it took. The children were not patients. They were data points. Their cries were background noise. Their lives disposable. This is what makes the story unbearable. These weren't the monstrous acts of a sadist working in the shadows, but sanctioned research carried out under the approving gaze of universities, governments, and institutions that should have known better. The files, the charts, the cold handwriting of a man who measured pain like a scientist measures temperature, they still exist. They reveal the chilling truth. The line between healer and executioner is thinner than we want to believe. And in this story, that line was not just crossed, it was erased. As we pull back the curtain on this hidden history, one question screams louder than the rest. How did he get away with it? How could a doctor known to experiment on children rise to prominence instead of being condemned? The answer is as disturbing as the acts themselves. Science, when unshackled from ethics, can become a religion of its own, worshipping progress at the altar of human sacrifice. The children were forgotten, their suffering buried under medical journals and polished reputations. For decades, their voices were silenced, their bodies discarded, their pain reframed as necessary for advancement. And yet, without them, many of the medical triumphs celebrated today might never have been possible. That is the unbearable weight of this story, the realization that modern medicine carries a shadow, one built on the broken bones of innocence. This is not just history. It is a warning, because if it happened once, it can happen again. He was not born a monster. In the beginning, he was just another child, perhaps even fragile, shaped by an era that demanded greatness. He grew up in a world obsessed with discovery, where nations competed to produce the brightest minds, where science was glorified as the key to unlocking the future. From an early age, he showed signs of brilliance, quick with numbers, insatiable in curiosity, fascinated not by stories of knights and kings but by anatomy books, by diagrams of the human body. Teachers marveled at his intellect. Scholarships and opportunities flowed to him like a river feeding a growing storm. By the time he entered university, he was no longer an ordinary student. He was destined for recognition. Professors praised him. Institutions wanted him. He walked the polished marble halls of academies that promised prestige, and behind every door was another mentor eager to mold him into the next great name in medical history. But in that ambition, a seed took root. Not the seed of healing, but of domination. He began to see people not as lives, but as puzzles to be solved, problems to be tested, stepping stones to immortality. The public saw only the mask. He dressed impeccably, spoke with confidence, and knew how to command attention in lecture halls and operating theaters. Patients adored him, not because they knew him well, but because the newspapers called him brilliant, the hospitals gave him awards, and governments invited him to conferences. His name began to circulate in journals, attached to papers filled with groundbreaking theories and bold proposals. Every success, every glowing headline, cemented him as a man who could do no wrong. And yet, behind the curtain of reputation, the cracks were already forming. He was arrogant, dismissive of peers who questioned him, intolerant of failure. He demanded absolute loyalty from assistants and students, and those who resisted his methods found their careers quietly destroyed. He was learning not just the art of medicine, but the art of control over institutions, control over reputation, and most of all, control over the weak. It was this armor of prestige that would allow him to hide his darkest secrets in plain sight. At first, his ambitions were not unusual. Every doctor dreams of breakthroughs, of curing the incurable. But ambition, when coupled with arrogance, warps into obsession. He began chasing questions others would not touch. Why do children die so young? How can disease be stopped before it starts? What hidden triggers inside the human body could be unlocked, rewritten, mastered? They were noble questions, but his methods were not noble. He believed that boundaries existed only to be broken. If the rules of ethics slowed him down, then ethics were obstacles, not laws. He began experimenting first on animals, then the poor, then the unwanted. Slowly, the path narrowed toward the most vulnerable of all, children. His journals reveal the shift. One line here, a calculation there, notes that seem harmless until read in the full light of history. To him, the children were not sacred. They were the purest data, untouched, uncorrupted by the complexities of adult life. He convinced himself it was logical, even necessary. And once he crossed that line, there was no going back. Every monster needs protection, and he had plenty. Universities funded his work because it brought prestige. Hospitals gave him wards to command because his name attracted donations. Governments shielded him because his research promised advantages in health, warfare, and national pride. If whispers of his methods spread, they were silenced. If rumors reached officials, they were buried beneath piles of paperwork and excuses. It is for science. It is for the future. It is for the good of all. The children had no voice, but he had the backing of power. And in a world where progress was worshipped, few dared to ask what price was being paid in the shadows. He was untouchable, cloaked in reputation, adored by society, defended by institutions. To the world, he was the future of medicine. To the children who crossed his path, he was the end of hope. The descent into horror did not happen overnight. It began quietly with a single child, nameless in the records, faceless in history. Perhaps it was an orphan handed over by a state institution, or a child deemed too weak to live long anyway. To the outside world, it was medical treatment, a routine procedure carried out by a respected physician. But behind locked doors, something else was happening. Needles pierced skin not for healing but for testing. Strange concoctions were injected, not to cure but to observe the effects. The child's reactions were carefully documented. Fever, seizures, silence. When the child died, the doctor did not see tragedy. He saw data, numbers on a chart, proof that his theories could be tested, that boundaries could be pushed. That first death was not an end but a beginning. Soon one child became 2, then 10, Then an entire ward filled with small, fragile bodies treated not as patients but as specimens. The children were never asked, never warned, never given comfort. They were raw material, disposable in the name of science. What happened in those rooms is difficult to imagine, but the documents speak for themselves. Injections of diseases to study immune response. Starvation experiments to measure how long the body could endure without food. Surgeries without anesthesia, performed not to heal but to watch how the body reacted to shock and pain. Children were deliberately infected with tuberculosis, measles, and other deadly illnesses, left to suffer while their decline was charted in neat handwriting. Some were exposed to extreme heat or cold, others forced to consume poisons in carefully measured doses. Their cries echoed in the halls, but no one listened. Nurses were ordered to remain silent. Assistants threatened if they questioned orders. Each test was justified in the name of progress. If these children suffered, it was so that future generations might live. That was the twisted logic. But progress never came fast enough, and so the cruelty deepened. Every failure, every death, was simply a note in the margin of his grand experiment. The doctor knew exactly why he chose children. They were vulnerable. They had no power, no influence, no advocates. Many came from orphanages, poorhouses, or institutions for the disabled. Children's society had already abandoned. To the world, their lives were worth little, and to him that made them perfect subjects. He called them uncontaminated, their bodies unspoiled by the complexities of adulthood. In his journals, he described them like specimens in a lab, stripping them of identity, reducing them to numbers and symptoms. Some children lingered for weeks in agony before their small bodies finally gave out. Others died quickly, discarded and replaced with the next subject. Their graves were unmarked, their stories forgotten, their families, if any existed, told lies about their deaths. The scale of it is staggering. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, lost in experiments that yielded little more than fleeting recognition for their tormentor. Each tiny coffin was another stepping stone in his march toward infamy, though at the time the world still called it brilliance. What makes this story most chilling is not only what the doctor did, but how many knew and said nothing. Hospital staff whispered about the screams at night, but fear kept them quiet. Officials signed off on budgets without asking where the money went. Academic peers praised his results, pretending not to see the stains of suffering beneath his words. Parents were rarely informed. When they were manipulated into believing it was for the good of science. The very institutions meant to protect children instead turned them into commodities. Silence became complicity. Each unanswered cry, each unopened file, each buried secret was another layer of protection around the doctor. And so the experiments continued, year after year, hidden in plain sight, until the line between science and cruelty was no longer visible. The children had no one to speak for them, until much later, when fragments of their suffering would finally be uncovered. When the first whispers of cruelty began to circulate, the doctor acted swiftly. Not with apologies, not with remorse, but with precision, the kind of precision he applied to his experiments. Files that contained too much detail were quietly removed from archives. Death certificates were rewritten to list natural causes instead of unexplained illness. Assistants who showed hesitation were dismissed, their contracts terminated, their reputations smeared. Hospitals locked away documents in restricted cabinets where only a handful of trusted officials could access them. Journals that carried traces of uncomfortable truth were edited before publication, stripped of context that might raise suspicion. In some cases, entire batches of data were destroyed, burned in furnaces under the pretext of clearing storage. The result was a carefully curated history in which the children's suffering was erased, leaving only the illusion of progress. To the outside world, it seemed as though nothing unusual had happened. Inside the institution, however, the silence was deafening, the silence of people who knew but chose survival over truth. No man, no matter how cunning, can maintain such atrocities alone. He needed protection, and the institutions around him provided it willingly. Universities lauded his discoveries, not daring to ask what methods had been used. Hospitals continued to grant him wards and funding, eager to be associated with his prestige. Governments, desperate for advancements in medicine, looked the other way, convinced that the ends justified the means. In private conversations, officials admitted unease, but in public, they defended him. It is for science, they said. It is for the future. Critics who raised concerns were silenced with bureaucratic pressure. Denied promotions, denied funding, sometimes accused of professional misconduct until their careers crumbled. In this way, the doctor became untouchable. Each institution wrapped itself around him like armor, deflecting blame, protecting its own reputation. The cover-up was not just his doing. It was a collective effort, a conspiracy of silence that allowed him to continue unchecked. The most powerful lies are not shouted. They are whispered in the language of reason. The cover-up thrived because it wore the mask of logic. Every questionable act was explained as necessary. Every death was unfortunate but unavoidable. When parents demanded answers, they were told their children had been part of something noble, that their suffering was not in vain, that the future of medicine required sacrifice. Academics repeated these words in polished reports, transforming atrocities into statistics. Even the terminology was designed to hide the truth. Children were not victims, but subjects, not tortured, but observed, not killed, but lost. This language seeped into the records, rewriting cruelty as progress, disguising horror as research. By the time anyone looked closely, the truth was buried under layers of official-sounding lies. And the more the lies spread, the harder it became for anyone to challenge them without looking like an enemy of science itself. The cover-up was successful, but it came at a terrible cost. Generations grew up never knowing the truth, their textbooks praising discoveries without mentioning the children whose lives had been stolen. Doctors and scientists, inspired by his work, unknowingly built upon a foundation of suffering. Families who had lost children never received answers, only silence, only graves without explanation. The institutions that had protected him grew stronger, their reputations untarnished, their histories polished. And the children, they were left with nothing, no names, no memorials, no justice. The price of silence was not just the loss of truth, but the erasure of countless lives from the collective memory of humanity. To this day, the cover-up stands as one of the darkest reminders of what happens when reputation, ambition, and fear outweigh morality. It is a lesson written in vanished records and forgotten graves, a lesson the world almost never learned. For years, the doctor's reputation had been airtight, his crimes hidden behind sealed files and polished speeches. But no secret stays buried forever. The first cracks appeared not from a powerful institution or a determined prosecutor, but from ordinary people who could no longer ignore what they had seen. A nurse who had heard the cries of children at night, an assistant who had quietly copied notes before being dismissed, a grieving parent who doubted the story of natural causes on a death certificate. At first, their voices were scattered, whispers in the dark. They were ignored, mocked, even threatened. But whispers have a way of gathering force, and soon they began to converge. Journalists with nothing to lose started sniffing at the trail. Activists began demanding answers. Small pieces of evidence, a misplaced file, a surviving medical chart, a forgotten grave, began to paint a picture too disturbing to dismiss. What had once been rumor was now evidence, and what had once been hidden began to shimmer just beneath the surface, waiting for someone brave enough to drag it into the light. It takes courage to stand against power, and those who did paid a heavy price. The first real breakthrough came from whistleblowers, insiders who had been part of the machinery of silence but could no longer bear the weight of complicity. Some smuggled documents out of archives, risking their freedom to preserve evidence. Others gave interviews under anonymity, their trembling voices recounting what they had witnessed in those sterile, blood-stained halls. One assistant described seeing children strapped to tables, their screams ignored as notes were scribbled. Another revealed how records were falsified, how deaths were explained away with bureaucratic language. These testimonies, once scattered, began to align, forming a narrative too consistent to ignore. The institutions tried to discredit them, painting them as disgruntled or unstable. But each attempt to silence them only fueled the fire. The truth was no longer just rumor. It was now testimony, and with it came the first real challenge to the doctor's untouchable reputation. When the truth finally broke into the open, the reaction was explosive. Families who had long accepted vague explanations for their children's deaths erupted in grief and fury. Citizens who once praised the doctor's name now spat it out with contempt. Students tore down his portraits from university walls, demanding his name be erased from the annals of honor. But exposure came with a cruel irony. The same society that had worshipped him now claimed ignorance, as if no one had ever known, as if the institutions had not willingly protected him for years. The outrage was real, but so was the hypocrisy. Politicians denounced him while ignoring their own complicity. Academics rewrote history, distancing themselves from the man they once praised. Yet amidst the chaos, one truth could not be denied. The children's suffering had finally been heard. Their cries, once silenced by locked doors and sealed files, now echoed across the world. For the first time, the doctor was not a savior, not a genius, but a monster unmasked before the eyes of history. Long before the doctor ever faced a courtroom, he was already standing trial in the eyes of the world. Newspapers printed his name in bold letters beside words like monster, butcher, and criminal. Survivors and grieving families demanded justice, holding up faded photographs of the children who had been lost to his experiments. Protesters gathered outside hospitals and universities that had once celebrated him, their chants echoing through streets that had once applauded his brilliance. Politicians who had shielded him now scrambled to distance themselves, their voices trembling as they denounced the very man they had once praised. This was the court of public opinion, and in it, he had already been condemned. Yet the real question remained: would the legal system, so often slow, so often cautious, finally hold him accountable, or would his armor of connections, prestige, and institutional loyalty protect him even now? When the trial began, it drew crowds unlike anything seen before. Journalists filled the benches, sketch artists captured every movement, and survivors, some now grown, others still haunted by childhood trauma, sat in the audience, waiting to see justice unfold. The charges were staggering: crimes against humanity, abuse of power, murder disguised as medicine. Prosecutors presented the evidence with relentless detail. Journals filled with his handwriting, records of procedures performed on children, testimonies from assistants who had seen everything. The courtroom gasped at descriptions of experiments so cruel they seemed beyond belief. But the defense was prepared. They painted him not as a monster but as a visionary misunderstood, a man who had sacrificed for progress. They argued that his methods were of their time, that he had been following orders, that without him, countless medical advances would never have existed. It was a battle not just of facts, but of morality itself. A war between truth and denial, between memory and revision. The verdict, when it came, divided the world. For some, it was justice at last. Guilty on multiple counts, stripped of honors, his name forever stained. Families wept, not because justice could bring back their children, but because at last the truth had been spoken in a court of law. But others found the outcome hollow. Some charges were dismissed for lack of evidence. Certain institutions that had shielded him for years escaped without consequence. In some cases of history, the doctor never faced a trial at all. Death claimed him before justice could, leaving only untested accusations and a bitter sense of unfinished business. Whether punished or not, one thing became clear: no verdict could ever measure up to the enormity of the crimes. No prison sentence, no execution, no tribunal ruling could balance the scales weighed down by so many lost children. Justice in this story was always incomplete. Even after the trial, the debates raged on. Some argued that his research, no matter how horrifying, had contributed to medical progress, saving millions of lives. Others rejected this reasoning outright, insisting that knowledge built on blood was poison. Universities faced pressure to erase his name from lecture halls, yet some resisted, clinging to the idea that genius excused cruelty. Politicians promised reforms, yet loopholes remained. The trial became more than a reckoning with one man. It became a mirror held up to humanity, forcing us to ask, how far should we go in the name of progress? Where is the line between discovery and atrocity? And can a society that once enabled such crimes ever truly claim innocence? The debates continue even now, long after the doctor's name has faded. For in the end, the trial was never just about him. It was about us, our silence, our complicity, our hunger for progress at any cost. The story of the doctor did not end with his death or his trial. His shadow lingered, woven into the very fabric of modern medicine. Outrage over his crimes forced the world to ask questions it had long avoided. Could science exist without morality? Could discovery justify cruelty? In the years that followed, new codes of ethics emerged, born from the ashes of his victims. The concept of informed consent, the idea that no human being should ever again be treated as an object without choice, became the cornerstone of medical practice. Laws were written, committees formed, oversight demanded. The world vowed that never again would children or vulnerable people be used as tools for experiments. Yet these vows came too late for those who had already suffered. Their pain became the foundation upon which new safeguards were built. The legacy of the doctor was not just the horror he inflicted, but the reforms that rose in defiance of it. Every signature on an ethics code, every demand for consent, was a silent memorial to the children whose voices had been stolen. But legacy is never simple. While some reforms were genuine, others were cosmetic, designed to restore public trust without changing the deeper structures of power. Even today, science walks the same tightrope between ambition and morality. Pharmaceutical trials conducted in poor countries, secret military research, genetic experiments, all echo the same question. Have we truly learned? The doctor's story haunts every laboratory where corners are cut, every hospital where the poor are experimented on without full knowledge, every government project shrouded in secrecy. His shadow is not a relic of the past but a warning etched into the present. The children he used may be gone, but their suffering whispers through the halls of modern research facilities. The danger was never one man. It was the system that enabled him, the silence that protected him, and the ambition that excused him. That danger still exists, waiting for the next figure bold enough to cross the line. One of the most disturbing aspects of the legacy is the uncomfortable truth that some of his findings were indeed used. Medical textbooks, research papers, even vaccines carried traces of data that had been extracted through cruelty. This sparked endless debate. Should society benefit from knowledge gained through suffering, or should such knowledge be discarded entirely? Some argued pragmatism. If lives can be saved, then let no sacrifice be in vain. Others recoiled, insisting that using his work only prolongs the stain of his crimes. Universities quietly cited him while pretending not to. Scientists studied his records in secret, torn between horror and curiosity. The debate rages even now. Is it possible to separate the discovery from the method? Or does every use of his work keep his victims chained in history, their suffering exploited even after death? It is a question with no easy answer, one that gnaws at the conscience of science itself. In the end, legacy comes down to memory, and memory is fragile. Some societies chose to erase the doctor's name, stripping it from buildings, awards, and textbooks, as if silence could undo the past. Others chose to preserve his story as a warning, erecting memorials to the children, teaching his crimes in classrooms so that history would not repeat itself. Yet memory fades with time. Generations grow up never knowing the truth, never hearing the cries that once echoed in sterile halls. And so the responsibility falls on us, to remember, to tell the story, to honor the children not with silence but with acknowledgement. Their legacy is not just the safeguards we created, but the reminder that progress without humanity is not progress at all. It is destruction dressed in the language of discovery. The doctor wanted his name remembered as a pioneer. Instead, it survives as a ghost, a haunting reminder that the brightest light of science casts the darkest shadow when it forgets its soul. When we speak of the doctor, it is easy to become consumed by his name, his deeds, his infamy. But the true heart of this story does not belong to him. It belongs to the children whose faces history never recorded. Small faces, now lost to time, their laughter stolen, their futures erased. They were not volunteers, not pioneers, not participants in the march of science. They were stolen lives, stripped of choice, used and discarded as though they were nothing more than tools. Their cries echo faintly through the surviving records, but the details are sparse. A height, a weight, a medical notation where a name should be. They were erased twice, first in body, then in memory. And that is the final cruelty of it all, that while his reputation endured for decades, theirs were reduced to silence. As we close this story, we must remember that every statistic, every cold number in a dusty file, was once a child who wanted nothing more than to live. The story forces us to confront a question that is as relevant today as it was then. What separates healing from harm, progress from atrocity? The answer is not knowledge or skill but morality, a fragile line drawn by conscience. When that line is ignored, when ambition outweighs compassion, when institutions protect power instead of people, then the white coat becomes as dangerous as a weapon. The doctor's story is not just about one man, but about what happens when society bows to prestige and progress without asking who pays the price. It is a reminder that cruelty often wears a mask of reason, that evil does not always arrive with fangs and claws, but sometimes with a clipboard and a scalpel. And it asks us to consider, if the brightest among us could fall so far, what prevents it from happening again? History is not a closed book. The same patterns repeat, sometimes in different forms, sometimes in places we least expect. Around the world, there are still whispers of experiments conducted in secrecy, of vulnerable groups used as test subjects without consent, of governments funding projects hidden from the public eye. The doctor's story may feel distant, locked in the past, but its echoes are all around us. Each time ethics are dismissed as obstacles, each time suffering is justified as necessary, the shadow grows longer. The children's stolen voices warn us. The danger is not gone, only waiting for another moment of weakness. The legacy of the doctor is not just what he did, but the fact that his story can happen again if vigilance fails. Science without a soul is still science, but it is no longer human. And so we arrive at the end. Not a neat ending, not a resolution that restores balance, but a haunting truth that lingers. The doctor sought immortality through science, but what he achieved was something far darker. His name is remembered not for healing, but for cruelty. His legacy is not triumph, but a warning. The children he used, though nameless and forgotten by institutions, remain the true authors of this history. Through their suffering, the world was forced to confront its own moral failures. Through their silence, we were taught to listen more closely. Their story is carved not in monuments or textbooks, but in the conscience of humanity. As we close the final page, one thought remains: progress without humanity is not progress at all. It is destruction disguised as discovery. And if we ever forget that, then the doctor's story will not just be history. It will be prophecy.